Welcome back everybody to The Forge for week 3 of game development. And this week we're going to dive headfirst into story and the importance of narrative. First off, let's talk about the idea of a story. Okay, historically, stories have always been something that were enjoyed by an individual, whereas games tended to be something that were enjoyed by a group. Stories that were enjoyed by an individual were single-threaded experiences. In other words, the story had a beginning and middle and end that never really changed. You could read the same book a million times and it's not going to change the story, right? Whereas games that involved multiple people could have any number of outcomes. It's not always predictable who's going to win. That kind of interactivity with the game and its rules doesn't really fit in this linear story pattern, right? But let's again lift up out of the game itself or the book itself, right? And realize that these aren't the things to focus on. What we focus on is the experience of the individual interacting with them. Right? Just because two people read the same book doesn't mean those two people are necessarily reading the book the same way or getting the same things out of that book. This is what we're going to call the myth of passive entertainment, right? The idea that any entertainment is completely passive, that it just happens to a person, right? Because even if there's no interactivity, something like listening to a song or watching a movie, right? Those don't have the level of interactivity that games do, but just because you're not physically interacting with something, you're very much subliminally interpreting that art form, right? You're having that experience. A truly masterful storyteller knows how to create the desire to act within the listener's mind, right? Only really great directors or great songwriters know how to inspire their audience through their art. So this is what we're really seeking to do, and this is why we have a lot to learn from the art of storytelling. It's not just about the rigidity of a sequence of events. Again, it's about what experience can we give the player, or how can we inspire them to interact with our game. Now we can think of storytelling from two extremes. One is the one I just described, where it's this linear sequence of events. We'll call that the string of pearls, where you have event A that leads to some action, event B that leads to some action, event C, right? So we just have this boom, 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 boom string of events all the way down to the end. Now let's go to the other stream where something is completely open-ended. Take Minecraft, for example. Before story mode, Minecraft really was just an open world, right? Where players were left to their own devices to create their own stories. In other words, an engine was set up with a bunch of tools and environments for you to interact with, but there was no spelled out plot line. You kind of made that up on your own. Now, while it doesn't seem like that's really storytelling at all, right? There's no plot. You just put me in a sandbox and I did whatever, right? Again, we're focusing on experience. You can get experience out of a string of pearls, and you can get an experience out of an open-ended sandbox. More and more, the best games that you see today, though, find some middle ground and a way to use both of those elements. Now there's a handful of things you really want to consider when approaching story in your game. Number one is that good stories have unity. What you don't want to do is skip over a bunch of plot lines that really don't have anything to do with each other. If you're going to set up a problem early on in your game or early on in your story, it has to be the driving force throughout. Number two is considering the amount of options you give in the middle of your story. If the story has to end and it's always going to end the same way, and you have a bloat of options in the middle that all eventually lead to the same thing, then really how meaningful can any of those options be? If you know that no matter what you choose, things are going to end up the same way, that's something you want to watch out for. Really closely related to that is that multiple endings can disappoint. This is where you're teetering on that border between completely open-ended and a linear string of pearls. If there's too many different ways that your story can possibly end, and the player reaches one of those ends, then all they're really going to do is obsess about, well, what could I have done differently to have a different outcome? And at that point, you've kind of lost this whole idea of telling a story in the first place. All the player's going to be doing is just manipulating things to get the outcome that they want. It does cheapen the experience. Another point to remember is action. Now, in more passive entertainment mediums, say TV or movies, for example, there's plenty of action on screen because that's what really keeps your interest. Even walking from one place to another is some kind of action, right? But what happens, say, if you pop on GTA and just don't touch the controller? Yeah, not too fun to watch. You need to make sure that there's ways for your main character in your story to interact with and act upon the world. And it's a common oversight because you figure the player's just gonna intuitively do that on their own. Not always so. You definitely need to provide those kind of situations that allow that kind of action and verbs to exist in your game. Last thing to really keep in mind in terms of story with video games is time travel. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about time travel as a mechanic in your game, which has become pretty popular in the last 10 years or so, but even the idea of saving a game, being able to go back to an older save, right? This is not necessarily something I recommend striking from your game, but realize that that's just part of the player's experience. If a player dies or loses a specific character, they can always go back and reload and try something else, right? So you have to construct your story around this problem, realizing that your story still has to be engaging even though they may repeat the same section of game over and over again just to save a character. Again, your focus is to create meaningful, innovative, and mind-expanding experiences, keeping in mind that you may need to mix traditional storytelling and unconventional storytelling methods in various ways. Ask yourself these questions. Does my game really need a story, and why? Will the players be interested in this story? How does my story and narrative support the other 3 elements of gameplay? And vice versa, how do those other 3 elements support my story? And as with everything else in game design, how can it be better? How can my story be better? There is a vast world of story writing resources and materials that you can look over. I'm sure you guys will have a lot of fun just imagining whatever it is you can imagine and putting it onto paper and getting your ideas out of here and into the world. That's what we really want to do. I'm really looking forward to the stories and the worlds that are going to come out of the assignments this week, and I can't wait till next week when we take those stories and apply them to the broader scope of world building. Have fun, be creative, and see you in the Forge.